Washington did not respond to the instructions of Putin's nuclear tests, saying the Kremlin in the air rain. A former advisor to Trump on national security, John Bolton, in Dubai, away from the people, where officials flew on National Unity Day. The crisis on the Patriarchs. Restaurants are closing in one of the most prestigious districts of Moscow. 7 o'clock in the evening in Moscow today is Thursday, the 6th of November. You are watching The Rain. This is a program here and now. My name is Valeria Ratnikova. Let's sum up the results of this day. Moscow has not received an official reaction from Washington to Vladimir Putin's instruction concerning nuclear tests. This was stated today by the Kremlin's speaker Dmitry Peskov. The day before, during a staged meeting of the Security Council, the Duma speaker Vyacheslav Volodin suddenly addressed Putin. People's deputies are concerned. How so? The US starts nuclear tests. And what's worse for us? Well, the head of state instructed. But apparently, he did not give it clearly enough, because today his speaker Peskov had to criticize the Western media, which misunderstood everything. It turns out that Putin did not say to start nuclear tests, but only said to work out the possibility of starting them.
And despite the clear wording of the president, well, this is a continuation of such a rather emotional, overly emotional reaction of the Western media. Many do not disdain simply to distort the meaning of what has been said. And all this is in line with this militaristic anti-Russian hysteria, which is now raging in the Western countries.
But in the United States, the Kremlin's serious nuclear rhetoric does not stop Trump. On the contrary, he once again repeated his instruction to resume nuclear tests, although the states conducted such tests more than 30 years ago.
We have rebuilt our nuclear power industry. We are the #1 nuclear power. And I hate to admit it because it's terrible. This is a terrible situation. If this weapon ever has to be used, Russia is in second place. China is in third by a large margin. But they will catch up with us within 4 or 5 years and will be able to catch up with us. Maybe the three of us are working on a denuclearization plan. Let's see if it works.
However, the first move in a new round of nuclear escalation was still Putin's statements. He showed the world Petrel and Poseidon, which supposedly have no analogues in the world. Well, we are joined by Andrei Korobkov, Professor of Political Science International Relations at the University of Tennessee. Hello.
Hello.
In your opinion, how far can this mutual nuclear rhetoric go now?
But we must remember that in February of next year will expire on the last contract that exists between the US and Russia. This is a treaty that in the United States is called a New START. In Russia, there are 3 strategic offensive arms treaties. And after that there will be no legal basis at all for both arms limitation and cooperation in this area. Therefore, in general, here we see such rapid activity on both sides. Moreover, it should be taken into account that the situation has changed in recent years. Firstly, the technology has changed, and secondly, what has changed is that, in fact, some missiles that are capable of carrying nuclear weapons, although at the tactical level they are used in the war in Ukraine. Well, we must take into account that nuclear weapons are an industrial product, like others, so they have a guarantee, these warheads. And, in principle, of course, they need to be checked periodically. But since the 96th year, the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty has been in force. And here the question of the reliability of the weapon already takes place. Naturally, the relations now are not the same as they were in the mid-90s, to put it mildly, and in addition, of course, there is a factor of China. It still has much fewer weapons, but over the past 20 years, the number of warheads has tripled there. And all this in general leads to the fact that the parties are very active in the conditions of such tension. Moreover, it is clear that there were talks in Alaska about returning to some kind of negotiations, but as we see, little came of it. The war continues. Therefore, such activity is visible both in Russia and in the USA. I think that whatever happens, it seems that we will return to the trials.
And you mean real nuclear tests, because Trump's order turned out to be a little vague. He even tried several times to clarify American journalists. Yes, he said on a parity basis as well as other countries. But other countries do well. That is, Russia was not as such a nuclear test was a test media. This is what he had in mind how to explain it.
The fact is that it is impossible to start such tests quickly. This preparation will take several years. And apparently, Trump, seeing what is happening on the other side of the watershed, in general, gave the appropriate order. Preparation will be carried out. The question is that will be the test, but it of course will depend on bilateral relations and firm the general situation in the world. At the moment, more than 180 countries have committed themselves not to conduct such tests, but at the same time, a number of major players, even if they signed the treaty, they have not ratified it. Therefore, technically they have the right, even without leaving the contract, to conduct such tests.
As I understand it, your forecast is that it will happen after all, that nuclear tests will begin. And what consequences can this have? There is a lot of speculation around the approach of some possible Caribbean crisis. God forbid. Yes, in general. This whole story with the fact that the world has returned to nuclear rhetoric seems to have been forgotten for many decades. What will happen next in your opinion?
Naturally, a very unpleasant precedent is being created, and others will follow this example. Moreover, a number of countries either have not signed or have not ratified the relevant treaty, including nuclear countries. And well, we are on the threshold of a new round of the arms race, and at a fundamentally new technological level. So there's nothing good about it.
Yes, I wanted to ask you again, that's actually the point of what Trump is doing now. Is he really already thinking more globally, just in the context of that new arms race, or are these still the last attempts to put pressure on Moscow, to put pressure on Putin, to go to an agreement on Ukraine?
As always with Trump, there are a number of factors, a number of considerations, and both of these lines, which you mentioned, are present. On the one hand, this is also a mechanism of pressure, or rather counterpressure on Putin. He has sent a clear signal that, in general, the United States is ready to take up the challenge in this area here. On the other hand, Trump is still the biggest game for China. And seeing that China is actively, first of all, modernizing, and secondly, expanding its nuclear potential, which basically now still remains at the tactical and not at the strategic level. Trump is also preparing to restructure both the nuclear ammunition and the nuclear forces themselves. In other words, more and more attention, of course, will be paid not only to Russia, but also to China. This, in fact, is the whole of Trump's entire geopolitical strategy.
Thank you. It was Andrei Korobkov, a professor of political science and international relations at the University of Tennessee. Well, at the end of our issue, we will return to this topic again. And we are waiting for Donald Trump's former National Security Advisor John Bolton on our air. So watch until the end and don't miss it. Well, today's news release, like all the others, was made possible thanks to you. The main sponsor of The Rain is you, our viewers. We can't do it without you. So, please continue to support us in connection with the Russian language. Men from South Africa at war in Ukraine. The authorities of the South African Republic have launched an investigation into the circumstances of 17 of their citizens being sent to the front in Ukraine. The government of the country stated that they received a distress signal from the men. The men said that they were lured to the war under the pretext of lucrative labor contracts. They are between 20 and 39 years old, and the men were trapped in the east of the country. The statement said, I will quote the government of the country. President Cyril Ramaphosa has ordered an investigation into the circumstances that led to the recruitment of these young men into this apparently mercenary activity. At the same time, it is not noted on which side the citizens of South Africa are fighting. The Reuters news agency recalls that in August, the country's authorities issued a warning not to accept, quote, fake job offers in Russia, which appeared on social networks after South African women were fraudulently forced to work at a drone manufacturing plant in Alabuga. I would also remind you that several countries have already announced recruitment into the Russian army, including through social networks. It is known about the recruited citizens of India. The country's authorities resolved this issue at a meeting with Vladimir Putin. On Monday, a rally was even held in Delhi by relatives of Indians who were tricked into enlisting in the Russian army. The parents, brothers, and sisters of the recruited citizens took to the street. There was a poster with 20 photos of Indians in military uniforms at the rally. Some are missing. 2 of them have died, but relatives cannot get the bodies back. Also, foreign publications wrote about the recruitment of citizens of Cuba and Nepal. Memorial Day of the graduate at the Novosibirsk School in the city of Berdsk. They decided to recall Lev Sirotkin, who studied at school number 8 from the 1st to the 7th grade, then went to vocational school, graduated from it in 2004, and 18 years later signed a contract with the Wagner PMCs and then with the Ministry of Defense. What he did after graduation and before the war, the school museum does not tell, but they say that for participating in the invasion of Ukraine, the man was awarded medals for bravery and the Bakhmut meat grinder. He died on the 6th of November, 2024. The museum hung photos of Sirotkin. Today, the relatives of the deceased laid flowers at the memorial. The authors of the post in the school group wrote that Leo was kind, sympathetic, distinguished by responsibility and patriotism, willingness to resolutely fulfill his duties, but they did not mention his repeated convictions. Meanwhile, in the 2017, Sirotkin received 3.5 years in a strict regime colony for intentionally causing serious harm to health, life-threatening, with the use of an object as a weapon. What follows from the resolution, and the fact that Sirotkin asked a friend with whom he was drinking where the phone was, and, having received an unsatisfactory answer, stabbed a drinking companion with a knife. And in 2021, Sirotkin was sentenced to a year, conditionally for intentionally causing minor harm to health, again with the use of an object. Finally, in the 22nd, Sirotkin received 2 years and 3 months in a strict regime colony for theft. On the 19th of February, the 22nd year, Sirotkin, together with his partner, broke into someone else's garage and took out of it property worth 37,000 rubles. A war of everyone against everyone, or a new episode of confrontation within the Z community. They are discussing the detention of Z author Oksana Kobaleva. She is also the author of the Akronota Quilted Jackets channel. The Z channel of the Veterans Note writes that Kobaleva was detained together with her husband. The Z activist criticized the commander of the Chechen Special Forces Akhmat Abduladenev before her detention. He, in turn, commented on the sending of WAV operators to the meat assault for criticizing the commanders and wrote that the commission on this case was conducted with violations. Kobaleva also said that only foreign agents and extremists can speak out in this way, but what was the reason for her detention? It is unknown. After the conflict with Aladenev, screenshots of posts in Kobaleva in LiveJournal from 2012 year were distributed in Z resources. Allegedly, then she advocated an armed uprising against Vladimir Putin. Well, A new analysis of propaganda from Lucy Green has been released on the YouTube channel of Rain. A descendant of Nicholas I visited the front. Artemy Lebedev is a fan of Zemfira, and Tsargrad stands up for Z-blogger Tatiana Mantian, who is included in the register of extremists and terrorists. Watch, comment, and share with your friends. Lebedev continues the war with Roskomnadzor. The doctrine of distortion from Norkin. The Tsargrad is a mountain of Zamontian. What? Yes. And where did the descendant of Nicholas I lose his Russianness? And now everyone amicably goes to YouTube to watch the new issue of Fantastic Creatures and prints comments on this video with their paws. Because I read them all, and they are very important to me. National Unity Day away from the people. The publication Can Explain found out where officials went to rest during the November holidays. The most popular destination is the United Arab Emirates. As journalists write, the plane of the head of Chechnya Ramzan Kadyrov landed in Dubai. He can explain. He writes that the son of the head of the republic, Adam, uses a liner for $80 million. A plane linked to former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev was spotted in the same country. First Deputy Prime Minister Denis Manturov could also visit the UAE. His Sukhoi Superjet 100 stayed in Abu Dhabi for 5 days, after which it flew to Moscow. On the 5th of November, Manturov's jet flew to Tel Aviv. Let's talk in more detail about the travel of officials. With Ilya Davlyachny, a journalist of the project, we can explain. Hello?
Yes, Lair, good evening, and hello to all the viewers.
It's not a new tradition for officials to fly away for the holidays somewhere far away.
Well, no, this is not a new tradition, but it became a good thing that they flew away en masse like this. And on the most, well, probably the most terrible, yes, such a holiday, is the Day of National Unity. These holidays are in November. They have really become vacation days for many Russian officials, businessmen, oligarchs, and, probably, children. Let me explain what I'm talking about. Here you said about Kadyrov. Indeed, he has the plane, the Airbus, which it uses, but probably for a decade. So, judging by the leak of the FS border service, Kadyrov really used it. Well, for example, on the 16th of July of the 23rd year, Ramzan Kadyrov flew to the United Arab Emirates Abu Dhabi on this plane. But there is, for example, the 31st of December, 2022nd year. So, at 3 o'clock in the morning, 30 minutes later, none other than Ramzan Kadyrov's son Adam flew by this plane to the United Arab Emirates. Well, according to the passport, he is a Mohammad. So Mohammad Kadyrov arrived in Dubai well, and there was apparently all that the January holidays. But, by the way, the story that planes are inherited is such a novelty, and it concerns not only Ramzan Kadyrov. Today, the project wrote that Putin and his friends sent their heirs their to various posts, and they occupied 24 positions there. So, it turns out that airplanes, too, are now inherited from us. There is Dmitry Medvedev, whom you also mentioned. He also has a Bombardier Global plane on October 31st. He flew to Abu Dhabi. But we are not sure that Dmitry Medvedev is using it now, because he is not in the latest leaks of the FS border service. But there is another person there, whose name is Ilya Dmitrievich Medvedev. On the 8th of January of the 20th year, this man flew to the French Chambéry on this Bombardier Global plane, which was associated with Medvedev a long time ago from Moscow's Vnukovo airport, and this, by the way, is not the only story. He flew to Italy, Florence, and Switzerland, and so on.
Yeah, and in general, how do officials and their children, apparently, choose the direction where to fly? Because it is clear that their elections are still limited due to the numerous sanctions under which they found themselves, and it turns out that there are not so many places where they can relax.
Yes, this is a good question, and I understand that everything goes according to the residual principle there. But let's take, for example, Alina Kabeva. The fact is that, well, literally 4 months before the war, she also flew to these hateful countries of the West. Switzerland, Italy, and France were there. But when the war started and Alina Kabeva under sanctions, it actually blocked the way to Europe, and it flies well. Except that there Uzbekistan to Belarus, and in my opinion, in Kazakhstan it is still summer. But here, in fact, with the son of Dmitry Medvedev, the same story. Europe is completely closed to them. In fact, they remain, but these Asian countries remain, of course. Dubai is generally a favorite story, a favorite resort of Russian officials, Russian oligarchs, and, in fact, their children. There is another rather interesting story connected with Dubai. The fact is that on the 2nd of November, a Bombard Global plane landed there, which is used by the head of the State Corporation Web of the Russian Federation, Igor Shuvalev. And this is the story I would like to dwell on in more detail. The fact is that we found out at 20 this year that in the 22nd year, the same Bombardier Global State Company Web of the Russian Federation bought from a certain Cypriot offshore. So, this Cyprus offshore is in the famous Panama Papers leak. And if we look at who co-owned it, who is his co-owner of this offshore, then we will discover an amazing story. The fact is that the co-owner of this offshore company is the Luxembourg daughter of the Web of the Russian Federation. Summarizing, in other words, the Russian state-owned company buys a plane from itself, which is now flown by the head of this state-owned company, Igor Shuvalev, a corgi lover. As we all remember from the FBK investigation. But he flies to Dubai, it's clear why. Because he has a villa there, which costs about $8 million, which our colleagues talked about, well, back in the 16th year. The villa is located next door to another billionaire, the former owner of Uralkali, Dmitry Rybolovlev. So in general, in any normal country, the story of buying an airplane at home, it would lead to a criminal case of fraud, embezzlement of legalization. But, unfortunately, this does not happen in Russia, but we understand why.
But how much Tel Aviv is an unusual destination for officials? Again, yes, everything is really clear with Dubai, but still Tel Aviv in Israel, allied with the United States. There may even be some danger for them. How much is this a new direction?
No, there is no danger for them there, because, as we were told by sources close to the Israeli law enforcement agencies, many Russian officials and their children have dachas there. Well, let's take the most famous example of Chubai, who actually left Russia after the start of the war. They say that he also bought a house there. Well, Denis Mencherev flew to Tel Aviv, for example, for the November holidays. This is the first, in my opinion, deputy chairman of the government, and they say that he also met some friends there and flew on vacation. I don't know how much you can believe this, but his plane, which has been associated with him for a long time, has also been a lot of investigations about this. The Sukhoi Superjet from Abu Dhabi flew to Moscow and then flew to Tel Aviv on November 5th. Yes, they say that they have recreation centers there, they can relax there safely. Israel actually promised this very security, promised not to arrest them, not to put them under sanctions, not to fine them. So they use this very loophole. Both Mencherev and other officials fly there quite often now.
The last thing I wanted to clarify is actually what kind of money Russian officials are doing all this for. Do they use budget actual funds to fly to different countries like this?
Well, this is a difficult question because, well, formally, all these planes are not connected with the state in any way. Well, unless there are planes that belong to state-owned companies, well, Gazprom, Sberbank, because there is, for example, a jet that belongs to the Savings Bank and German Gref, for example, flew to Beijing not so long ago. There was some kind of summit and actually many officials and billionaires turned out to be there. In these cases, yes, money is paid directly from the state budget and flights of these very officials are paid for. In the case of, for example, Alina Kabayeva, because she did not fly on planes associated with Rostok or Gazprom. She fractated these planes by paying money for them, well, either in cash or transferring it to a card there. I doubt that the state paid for it, but in any case, yes, Alina Kabayeva is Vladimir Putin's mistress. It is formally and even informally documented by the same state.
Well, thank you. It was Ilya Davlyachin, a journalist of the Project We Can Explain. Well, now we're going to take a break for a short advertisement, but before that, I want to remind you not to lose access to independent. The surgeon Ekaterina Lanskaya, convicted of an unsuccessful operation to the rabbi's wife, said that she went to war with Ukraine. Now he works there as a medic. At the end of June, Ekaterina Lanskaya was sentenced to 11 months in the colony and banned for 2.5 years to engage in medical activities, but apparently the war with Ukraine as usual, the exception. It's not just doctors who are talking about the Lanskaya case and how women end up in a war zone. Materials of Alina Dedkovskaya. If my defenders have published this video, it means that I am already there. Plastic surgeon Ekaterina Lanskaya, previously convicted of an unsuccessful operation, announced that she had signed a contract with the Ministry of Defense and left for the war. Her lawyer confirmed it. Ekaterina Lanskaya, for almost a month working in the area of its. She works there as a doctor, operates on people, but I'm sure that in such a difficult period of our national life, Every doctor, if he were in my place, would do exactly the same. In June of this year, a court in Moscow sentenced the surgeon of Lanskaya to 11 months in a settlement colony, with a ban on practicing medicine for 2.5 years. In July, she reported a stroke. For 2 years, I have been fighting for justice in an attempt to prove that I am not to blame for the blindness of a sighted person. I didn't succeed. I lost. 2 years ago, in October of the 23rd year, Lanskaya worked at the Clinic of Aesthetic Medicine to Lasko and performed blepharoplasty. This is an operation to change the shape of the eyelids when, for example, bags under the eyes are removed. Her client was Inna Boroda, the wife of the president of the Federation of Jewish Communities of Russia, Alexander Boroda. She blamed the doctor for the unsuccessful operation because she began to lose her eyesight dramatically.
To date, one eye does not see zero at all, the second eye sees 30%. There is a whole series of painful operations to be performed because all this is done not under general anesthesia, but exclusively under local anesthesia. There have already been several operations, the eyes have been sewn up, the cornea is going to be changed.
The surgeon Lanskaya did not admit guilt. She insisted that her patient use drops that she did not prescribe for her. At the same time, the victim's lawyer said that it was Lanskaya who prescribed the drops for her. I believe that as a result of this criminal case, I will be deprived of the right to work and will not be able to work accordingly. The surgeon's lawyer, Kristina Vysotskaya, in an interview with RIA Novosti, clarified that the contract with the Ministry of Defense involves exemption from punishment, both basic and additional. I must say that women go mainly under the influence of propaganda. If we do not take cases, when we are talking about women of some more or less upper social stratum, judges are former investigators, officials, doctors, including if we are talking about middle class, middle class, and so on, then, of course, they go for freedom, the opportunity to be free. The first reports of the recruitment of women in the colonies appeared at the end of 2022 year. The first stage started from the occupied territories. It was a women's colony in the town of Sneznoye. Sneznoye is the LPR, and 50 women from there were sent by echelon to the so-called SVO, to the war. And the Ukrainian Security Service actually reported this. We checked, yes indeed, these were the first ones. Then they began to take in the area around Kushivka, and we were informed by local residents, because women worked from several colonies around Kushivka, worked there in agriculture. And they just stopped bringing them to work at some point. Well, then it went on. In the 2022 year at that time, Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu said that women would not be called up as part of the mobilization. However, then some still received summonses. Basically, these are those who have a military specialty. For example, the same doctors. But after the appearance at the military enlistment office, the Russians were released. Some still decided to go to war voluntarily. We called Valkyrie. I'm the deputy. The commander of the assault company did not have a single crazy thought, even that there were some somewhere, unfortunately. So I want the opposite. And last year, the governor of the Belgorod region, Vyacheslav Gladkov, even explained in his social networks how to get to the war for women.
The main question to the governor is handed over by Natalia Vyacheslav Vladimirovich, a resident of the Belgorod region. Whether it is possible to sign a contract for a woman with the Ministry of Defense and receive a payment. Dear Natalia, you can, but if you are a doctor.
For example, Putin met with female volunteers this year. In the 23rd year, my husband decided to become a participant in a special military operation, and I, as an accompanying evacuation platoon, unfortunately had to evacuate the body of my deceased husband. It is not known exactly how many Russians are at war now. In 2023 year, Shoigu said that 1,100 female servicemen take part in the so-called SVO, although experts say that more than 1,000 women could have left the colonies alone by today. Well, of course, this is the lower bar. I think it's much more, but let's say it's much more. I was wrong. Maybe 500 people. Propaganda regularly talks about Russian women who went to war with Ukraine, and if earlier propaganda media, as a rule, talked about Russian women doctors, now there are already stories about women stormtroopers, intelligence officers, and others. Donbass for Lugansk, where Nazism signed, where Bandera killed civilians for a long time, therefore an hour of mobilization. I said I would go, that's all. 1 second. That's it, I'm going. No more multi-visas. The European Union may stop issuing Schengen multi-visa to Russian citizens, I quote, in most cases. Three European officials told the Politician's publication about this. There is no official confirmation of this information. It is important to emphasize here. According to journalist sources, the new rules, which provide for the issuance of multiple entry visas only for humanitarian reasons, and in some cases may be adopted as early as this week. In other words, this means that in most cases only single-entry visas will be available to Russians. The policy reminds that Brussels has already complicated the procedure for issuing visas to Russian citizens, in particular after the start of a full-scale war against Ukraine. The visa facilitation agreement was suspended, and some EU states, for example, the Baltic states, have even adopted more serious visa restrictions. Journalists also remind that the issuance of visas is a national matter of each country of the European Union. This means that the European Commission can complicate this process, but it is not able to conduct a complete and comprehensive ban on entry for all Russian tourists. MEP Andrei Kavik is in touch with us. Hello?
Hello? I am speaking to you from the European Parliament in Brussels.
I would like to ask you first of all, if you can confirm the information of the politician that the relevant restrictions can really be adopted this week.
Yes, this is exactly the task that is being set within the framework of the 19th package of sanctions. To introduce additional restrictions for diplomats who travel to the countries of the European Union. And in most cases, visas will be issued to Russian citizens only once. In addition, tour operators will not be able to provide services on the territory of the Russian Federation. In other words, there will be no more group tourism of citizens from the European Union to the Russian Federation, and in the opposite direction from the Russian Federation to Europe.
I would like to clarify here, both diplomats and tourists will receive only a single-entry visa, or are we talking only about diplomats?
No, this applies to everyone and diplomats. They have a different status. Diplomats should be accredited either in a certain country. And the proposal now is that if Russian diplomats have been accredited in a particular country, they should not have the right to travel outside of that country without a special permit. If they want, at least let them turn to the authorities of the corresponding other EU country and ask them for permission. In the meantime, we have such a situation that Russian diplomats can freely move around all countries of the Schengen area. And we understand that the FS can use this for its own purposes to conduct some kind of espionage activities. Now, we want to put an end to this.
I want to clarify that the actual publication of the politician says that, after all, the issuance of visas is a national matter of each country. How will this be regulated? In other words, can one or another EU country decide anyway that there is no multi-visa there? It will issue it to Russian citizens.
No, listen, on the one hand, yes, each country can decide for itself how to deal with these issues. There are countries that impose more serious restrictions. Some countries approach this less strictly. But now a common approach is being established. In most cases, multiple entry visas will be issued only in case of some kind of humanitarian need. But the package of sanctions specifies an appeal to all countries to issue mainly single-entry visas to all citizens of the Russian Federation.
Andriy, then I want to ask you about the meaning of this measure, if indeed, in your opinion, it will be adopted, because, as we know, 30% of Russians generally have foreign passports, not the majority, but actually the Schengen visas themselves. According to various calculations, There are no exact figures, but at least it is believed that about 2% of only Russians have the same Schengen visas. What is the meaning of this measure? Not for diplomats, I emphasize here. Here I understand your position, but for all Russians, in principle. It is unlikely that this can somehow change their attitude to the war, if it was different, or even affect the Russian government in any way.
Well, I'm going to express my personal opinion now, and in principle, Yulia Navalnaya says the same thing. She says that there is no need to introduce additional restrictions, additional prohibitions for ordinary Russians. It is necessary to take measures against those who are guilty of this war against Ukraine, in those who are directly related to the aggression. Personally, I agree with this position. But I want to say that we need to adopt some kind of common opinion, develop a common position on this issue. And you yourself have just said that so far each country can determine priorities for itself. And some countries, for example, the Baltic states, Poland, and other Eastern European countries, they take a tougher position. And there are countries like Italy, Spain, France. They take a softer position. Even in the 24th year, they issued even more Schengen visas to Russians than before. But I perfectly understand what you mean, why you raise such a question. I understand that we should not punish ordinary Russians. We must send a signal to those who are really responsible for this aggressive war.
Yes, but judging by everything that you say, after all, this measure is likely to be adopted. Apparently it is as a punishment. Yes, if it can be formulated that way. I wanted to ask you from such a probably political point of view, is this measure, if it is still adopted, a manifestation of some impotence in the sanctions regime against Putin's government, which, as we see, continues the war, is not going to go anywhere, given that we know that Europe has not completely abandoned Russian energy carriers? It's much more complicated, but the visa here seems to be something that is easier to reach.
No, I would probably say that we have set for ourselves, and the energy I fully refuse to supply from Russia, and introduced very stringent measures against the so-called shadow fleet of Russian tankers taking serious measures. And in this regard, the question is also raised that all European countries should stop interacting with Russia and supply Russia with financial resources to continue the war. There is very little time left until the 21st of November. The situation with the Russian oil company Lukoil should be resolved in just a couple of weeks. Now an agreement is being drawn up on the acquisition of Russian assets and on the transit of energy carriers from Russia to Europe.
Well, thank you. It was Andrei Kabachev, a member of the European Parliament. We discussed how possible it is to adopt a new package of measures that will actually restrict the issuance of multi-visa to Russian citizens. European countries can and will still be able to issue single-entry visas, but Andrei Kabachev believes that most likely this measure will be really adopted. Patriotism and apologies not keep records for extremist symbols. Rapper Ice Gurgurt suddenly found himself under the gun of the police, and now he faces up to 15 days of arrest. Although the musician who gained popularity this year did not speak out against the authorities, even on the contrary. In an interview with the YouTube channel Vpiska, he answered the question like this: what should be a modern opinion leader influencing young people? I quote, "Patriotism must be pressed. Of course, reasonable, adequate, as it is now in our country." End quote. But Ice Gurgurt's reasonable patriotism did not suit the informers in the service of the authorities. Everything went wrong with his concert on October 26th, where he uttered the slogan "Life to Thieves."
So friends, I congratulate everyone on this day. Thank you for the fact that someone may have been present at the concert here. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for listening to the music. Life for Thieves. Let's go.
The next day, the video appeared on the Telegram channel of the most famous informer and now the shaman's wife Ekaterina Mizulina. From her post, it turned out that the life of thieves is not just a slogan, but I quote, the propaganda of a criminal subculture among teenagers. After all, the AU movement was recognized as extremist and banned in Russia. Basta's label artist Ice Gerger even apologized.
I must apologize for a phrase that I said recently without thinking at all. I drank and allowed myself too much. I do not support any banned organizations on the territory of the Russian Federation. I love my country and openly declare this at all my concerts and public events.
But it didn't help either. Today it became known that an administrative case was brought against him about a public demonstration of prohibited symbols. This was reported by the Moscow prosecutor's office, and in her formulation, it was as if she immediately copied Mizulina's complaint. Georgy Gergert is the real name of the rapper. From the stage, I quote, he uttered a slogan, which in its content is aimed at popularizing criminal culture and distorted value orientations, forming a positive perception of the criminal environment in the audience. But here it would seem what a powerful influence just two words can have. Since the 2010s, there has not been a single election in France that has not been affected by foreign interference, including Russian. This was discussed yesterday at a special session in the Senate in the upper house of the Fifth Republic. Experts on this issue spoke to French senators who warned of a growing threat, especially on the eve of the presidential elections of the 27th year. The goal of hostile agents, as they say, including the Kremlin, is to destabilize the elections with the help of fakes, undermining confidence in state institutions and democracy in general. My colleague Denis Kataev, who is connected to our broadcast firm, the Senate, attended the meeting. Denis.
Yes, hello, Valeria. Hello to all the RAIN viewers. Indeed, I am now in the Senate. Yesterday, I attended a meeting of the Commission on Legislative Culture, which gathered here to assess the risks of these modern digital technologies affecting the elections in France, and the mass use and opportunities of social networks, as what worried, of course, first of all senators. Manipulation of algorithms, intensive use of artificial intelligence contributes, in their opinion, to the promotion of a certain content, narrative in the French segment, including in the context of elections. This is a technique of destabilizing the electoral process with the help of these new methods. And all of this, of course, as they viewed it at this meeting, as a threat to democracy. An example, of course, the last elections were held in Romania and Moldova, and where indeed they directly called that large-scale foreign interference from Russia was used, they directly called Russia. And this example, in their opinion, illustrates how all these technologies can be transferred to France soon. In France, there will soon be presidential elections in the 27th year, and municipal elections in the 26th year, which is also a threat. For example, in Paris they will choose. And in general, they say that 25 attempts of foreign digital interference in European elections and legislative elections have been written off recently as Prime Minister, and there have been 11 attempts on the territory of Europe. And everything, in their opinion, in the opinion of senators, poses a threat to the functioning of democracy. And even I don't care what kind of information, it's important how it works. Let's listen to the speaker from the Ministry of Internal Affairs. The situation will escalate with the approach of the presidential elections of 2027 year, and possible parliamentary elections, which may take place on a fixed date or ahead of schedule. We are extremely vigilant about the risks of foreign interference in these major elections. After all, the false information that is spread on social networks and has a foreign origin does not really aim to convince the majority of French voters, but rather to sow doubts about the proper functioning of our democratic institutions. And this subtlety is very important. Large-scale hybrid attacks are not needed to destabilize our democratic system. Just a small spark of doubt is enough, which fuels conspiracy and casts doubt on the normal functioning of our democracy. Well, and important reports and figures, these are the data that, for example, 77 disinformation operations were undertaken from the 23rd to the 25th years on the territory of the European Union were presented by such an agency to combat foreign digital interference. It is called the Visinium. It has been operating in France since the 2010s of the years. and has been following all these attempts of foreign interference with fakes and so on, and since the 2022 year. It is claimed that this influence and interference is especially growing, and for such main trends are observed especially in elections. It is interference in political life France, in order to polarize public opinion out on hot topics. Yes. We remember the Olympics bugs undermine confidence in the legality of the electoral process, increase distrust of the media traditionally, the traditional press, and attract to alternative sources, to YouTube, for example, where ultra-right bloggers operate, and spoil the reputation of candidates or political parties, or promote, for example, their candidates, who in turn are already repeating such Kremlin narratives. Well, there is even such a program, which was described in detail in the Senate yesterday. It's called Storm 1516. This agency that deals with revelations was just talking about it. And before that, the Ministry of the Armed Forces and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs had already presented this program. These are operations that cover the entire spectrum, already from the world, the digital world. And the Foreign Ministry has already confirmed that many operations were carried out within the framework of this company, which were generated specifically in the Russian military intelligence of the GRU. And the Minister of Defense, even Foreign Affairs, said that the purpose of the action is that 1516 was aimed at the early pre-parliamentary elections in France, which took place in the 24th year after the dissolution of the National Assembly, as we know, yes. And even there, they even launched a false website of the presidential party Ensemble in this program, where it was written that here we allegedly Macron's party offered €100 to everyone who voted for it. And it moved both the official site. These are the mirror sites of doppelgangers. Yes, there is such a whole program of duplicates, they are just the same. And as an example of this information war of the Kremlin's major information war, which was just talked about yesterday, and the main purpose of which is to spread Kremlin narratives, and again, yes, this is so that doubt gets mixed up in Western society, that maybe it's time for us to return to traditional values. The goals are simple. It is the popularization of French society, the weakening of support for Ukraine, the destruction of national unity. And yes, let's hear what the representative of this agency for foreign influence, Vigenium, says about this. What did she say about it?
In this case, we are talking about an operation related to well-known actors, affiliated with the pro-Russian network Storm 15 or 16, and their network Copycop, who recently generated several hundred of sites using artificial intelligence. A third of these sites pose as regional media, and are designed specifically to disseminate alternative narratives in public opinion. Thus, I fully confirm that municipal elections also become the targets of such operations, and we are already preparing for these elections together with our administrative, interdepartmental, national and local partners. As for European international cooperation, indeed, France is now one of the leaders in the fight against foreign interference at the European level, Dennis, and yet it seems like now is a particularly good time to try to intervene, or as the French election in French politics, because here too, reports the publication Policy, which we now have quoted, that Macron record low rating, that he had become the least popular French president in the last 50 years. Here Le Figaro writes about the rating of 11%, the previous record of Hollande was beaten. What do you think about it?
What I think about this is that this rating of 11% more is being discussed just the same in the Kremlin media, in social networks. And this is just another such goal. First of all, yes.
Politics is not the Kremlin's media after all.
No, and I say no, you don't understand me. There is such information, I confirm it. She is really Le Figaro. But the fact that it is being discussed especially actively in the Kremlin media is part of it. This is taken as part of the fact. There really is such polls do have such figures, and then it extends into some of the Kremlin's goals with the right bloggers. We need narratives and so forth, that all things are bad, instead of just rating of Macron here is such at this stage. But no one is saying that many presidents in France do not have a low rating by the end of their term. But I wanted to say that really, if we recall the fakes that just yesterday too, in particular, yes. Many translated into an example called for example that we can show even this, for example. The distribution of an alleged video of a jihadist group that threatened to set Notre Dame on fire. If France does not release the author of the terrorist attack in Nice in the 20th this year. There was such information that was also peddled, of course, a lot of fakes around Vladimir Zelensky, what he bought there, we know. A Nazi building in Bavaria, a luxury hotel in Courchevel in General Zelensky as the main such goal. Here we see, yes, two covers of famous editions or Croix. On one it is written that Zelensky admits defeat there, and on the other the real information. That Ukraine continues its struggle with Zelensky is, of course, the main goal. And of course, now in a period of political instability, they create these mirrored media, such as fake covers of newspapers, journals. Where starting from this political instability again, the low rating of Macron, they can say, specially made to French society was divided in every possible way. So try to respond well, that's what they say representatives, experts, here again, the Ministry of Internal Affairs. As they react to it. Let's hear it. Of course, all of our intelligence services are already working to identify such foreign interference, which should be qualified as foreign to begin with. But it's not always so easy to do. But our European neighbors are helping us. As you know, the European Union has also been developing a protection system for some time. On the one hand, was created by the European Democratic Shield, and with another, the European Alert System, for the transmission of information in real time between different member states. Thus, the threat has been identified. It is being discussed today at the highest level, and we are now improving our institutional response to protect, of course, the integrity of voting in our democracy. Well, they say that France really has the means to counteract this foreign digital influence, including a national system for protecting the use of the same artificial intelligence. But they nevertheless urge not to hope for technology. It is necessary to work with the population, it is necessary to explain. It is also necessary for the traditional media to try to compete with these, in particular, ultra-right bloggers who are supported already from the ocean, including recall the case of Brigitte Macron, which I described in detail. So that's what she said about the work, and education in this direction is just possible. Agencies for combating foreign influence.
Indeed, it is necessary to raise awareness and education of all categories of the population on this issue. We often talk about young people, but in fact it concerns everyone. I want to inform you that we have recently been allocated additional funds so that at the end of the 25th year, we could launch an academy to combat information manipulation. We have been engaged in its preliminary development for several months. Since its inception, our role has mainly focused on operational investigations and interagency coordination with intelligence and other structures. However, in practice, we have been actively engaged in educational work among various audiences, public administrations, private structures, as well as representatives of civil society for several years.
And the last thing in the framework of this program that Lara wanted to say. This was the case that was called Red Hands here in France, where when in May of the 24th, they intended the victims of the Holocaust. They placed such red hands, and now just the other day the process took place. 4 Bulgarian citizens were found guilty by a Paris court for painting just, and one of them confessed. Even said that he received €1,000 for it, and all the others. There were 3 people in the dock, and the 4th was absent. He was on the run, and now all the others actually blamed him, although they received real terms from 2 to 4 years old, and said that it was he who gave them the command, and he was connected with Russia directly by the Kremlin. This is what the French authorities are talking about. This is what the very agency of the Viginium, which I spoke about, is talking about. Researchers say that in fact these Bulgarians who were arrested, Bulgarian citizens acted in the interests of the Kremlin and Russia. This is even stated in the judge's decision. They recognized that the interference is beyond doubt foreign Russian, and describes their actions as coordinated from abroad with a hostile purpose. In particular, condemned for the creation of a criminal community, in this case with the aim of foreign intervention. And specifically the battles of this process was constantly talking with Russia, like yesterday at this discussion in the Senate. And therefore Lara rating of 11%, of course, also, though it is the correct figure. It will be used specifically to destabilize the situation in the country.
But we also have a rating. You are more attentive than all of us. Thank you very much. These were the journalists leading the rain, Denis Katev. Well, we are joined by John Bolton, a former national security advisor to the US president, who met with Vladimir Putin in the 18th year, actually, when the US decided to withdraw from the Treaty on the Elimination of Intermediate-Range and Shorter-Range Missiles. Let's talk about the nuclear rhetoric that has now flared up. Hello.
Hello.
Thank you so much for joining, Mr. Bolton. I wanted to ask you first of all, how you interpret Vladimir Putin's words about possible preparations for nuclear tests. How do you evaluate them? What to expect from him now?
There have been a lot of statements on this topic, a lot of speculation about the fact that Russia and China actually continue to conduct nuclear tests, only not at full capacity. And these are such low-power tests that contradict the spirit of the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. And now Trump is saying that the United States should conduct its own nuclear tests in response. But in this regard, the question arises, to what extent can the nuclear powers be confident in their nuclear arsenal? As far as scientists are able to assess the condition of this arsenal, how much it is, how well the ammunition is in good condition, how safe they are.
Well, actually, what will be the next step? Because Trump really tried to ask him several times about what he means by this nuclear test. Is it a test of nuclear weapons directly or only carriers, as it was with Russia with the same Petrel and Poseidon? What will be the next step? Are these two countries really going to return to full-fledged nuclear tests after Trump's words, among other things?
And it seems to me that Trump himself does not understand what he is really talking about. On the one hand, he seems to be talking about real nuclear tests, but then the energy minister spoke. Our Ministry of Energy is responsible for nuclear tests. And he said yes, no, nothing like that. These are just ordinary so-called subcritical experiments, that is, small tests where there is no critical mass of fissile matter. We conduct them all the time, and this will just be another test. So no one can say for sure. But this kind of work, they are important in order to ensure the stability and reliability of the nuclear arsenal, to check the condition of nuclear ammunition. And it also affects the effectiveness of the nuclear deterrence system. And here we believe certain pressure from Russia and China. People would like to be confident in their nuclear arsenal, and for this, perhaps, as they say, it is necessary to conduct really nuclear tests.
But still, then for you it is rather disturbing news that there will be these very real nuclear tests with real nuclear explosions or vice versa.
Well, sooner or later, I think the US will have to conduct a nuclear test. I do not know when this will happen. We have practically not tested nuclear weapons for 30 years, and we must be confident in our nuclear arsenal. We must be able to understand that the weapons are still in good condition. I'm not talking about the fact that it will be necessary to conduct dozens of nuclear explosions, and even more so on Earth. But in any case, this treaty does not have full force, since neither Russia, the United States, nor China have ratified it. We are not talking about how to start a new arms race. If we talk about the United States, the task of nuclear tests is to demonstrate that our nuclear arsenal is reliable, that it is in good condition, otherwise we create a dangerous situation, where Russia or China or North Korea can increase their pressure on us.
Yes, but we already see how you react in Moscow, and how it interprets you actually in a conversation with Vladimir Putin. Speakers Duma say that just mean Western countries is increasingly threaten us. We also need to do something. I want to ask you against this background, going back 7 years ago, 2018 year, when you actually came to Russia, met with Vladimir Putin, and said then that the withdrawal, in fact, from the treaty before the on the elimination of intermediate-range and shorter-range missiles is not what will create a problem. Here's now the behavior of the Kremlin in the form of what was coming. In your opinion, make a mistake if you then or not?
No. The United States withdrew from the INF Treaty in the 18th year because there were only 2 countries in the world that agreed to assume similar restrictions on medium and shorter-range missiles. It was Russia and the USA. All other countries, China, North Korea, Iran, were not bound by obligations of this kind. and could freely develop such missile technologies. And taking into account all this, plus, given that Russia regularly violated the terms of this agreement, we decided that what is the point of us remaining the only country that complies with the terms of this agreement? That's why the United States decided to withdraw from this treaty. And this. Other members of the country, NATO members, also understood that they were threatened by Russian nuclear weapons. The threat is not primarily for the United States, but the threat is for them. Therefore, we had to provide effective nuclear deterrence.
In other words, in your opinion, even seeing what the Kremlin is doing now, it was the right decision then, in the 18th year?
Yes. I think it was the right step, because at that time, Russia deployed missiles that violated the treaty, the provisions of the INF Treaty. They placed Iskander missiles on the territory of the Kaliningrad region, and it turned out that there was only one country left. The United States, which was bound by some obligations, and all the other countries in the world could do absolutely anything they wanted. But why on earth should the United States tie its hands in such a situation and somehow limit its military capabilities, both in Europe and around the world?
I would also like, perhaps interpreting and predicting what Donald Trump can do now, to find out from you how this decision was made then. After all, it was his idea in the first place, or, I don't know, in discussion with you among others, we came to this conclusion.
No, well, I recommended it to him, but in principle, all the other advisors told him exactly the same thing.
Yeah, well, thank you. It was John Bolton, the former national security advisor to the US president. We discussed how the situation with nuclear tests will develop further, apparently mutual, which are hinted at in the Kremlin, and Donald Trump speaks directly. The crisis at the Patriarch's Ponds, the Moscow edition of Msquan writes about the closure of restaurants one after another. Journalists have estimated that over the past few months, 11 establishments have closed. In one of the most prestigious districts of Moscow, the owners of the Nude Wine Bar were the last to announce the closure. He has been working for the Patriarchal Osh since 2014 year. The co-founder of the institution, Artur Bersirev, told reporters that they would not restart the project, and the decision to close it was not due to any supernatural reasons, I quote, just because of financial reasons. But this is not a rental, as the room I have in the property. It seems to me that this will be a philosophical conversation. Why Old Cafe More can't work now, end quote. But among the reasons, the businessman calls the change of the public. New people need new establishments, writes Msquan. And here's what the gastro critic Alexander Ilyan told reporters about the reasons for the closure of restaurants on the Patriarchs.
A part of the advanced public has left, and now rather visits restaurants in Armenia and Georgia, at least. They used to go to Patriarchs. Elementary owners leave, or half of the kitchen goes to their own. These are actually quite tough reasons that everyone is silent about, but they are there.
Among the reasons are also called the rising prices for rental of premises. I quote the director of business development of VSN Group, Alexander Mesheryakov, who also spoke with journalists. For restaurants with high cost and fixed costs, such a load becomes critical, especially against the background of a decrease in effective demand and a changed audience of the district. It is the growth of rental rates that many owners call one of the key reasons for the closure of establishments. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum has filed charges against a man who tried to kiss her on the street. Surprisingly, even the head of state has faced harassment. On November 4th, in the Central District of Mexico City, Claudia, in front of other people, a man came up from behind and tried to kiss her and take her by the chest. The woman was saved by an assistant. And now this man has already been arrested, is in custody in the Sexual Crimes Investigation Department, and the police suspect him of involvement in 2 more episodes of harassment that happened on the same day. And so, at her daily press briefing, Scheinbaum said that she had made an official accusation against the man and called for a thorough review of laws and procedures so that it would be easier for women to report such attacks. Sexual harassment is not a criminal offense in all states of the Republic, but it is in Mexico City. I came to the conclusion that if I don't report this as a crime, then apart from the fact that it is a crime, what position will all Mexican women be in if they commit this against the president? What will happen to all the young women of our country then? Therefore, I was forced to file a complaint with the Mexico City Attorney General's office, because this is a common law crime. It turned out that this man then harassed other women right there on the same street. Therefore, he is now in custody. Well, that's it for me. Thank you for following the news with us. Don't forget to turn on the morning news in the rain tomorrow at 10 o'clock in Moscow. They will be conducted by my colleague Mikhail Shevelev, and my name is Valeria Ratnikova. Goodbye.